Have you ever worked or seen a code base that logs analytics events like this? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you 4 reasons why you should stop logging events this way. Alright, so first we're going to build this logger architecture, which is typically a class logger that will hold a static accessor. So let's call it a shared instance. And this is going to be of type logger. And we're going to initialize it. Loggers implemented this way is called a singleton. So to make it a real singleton, we need to make our private initializer so that it cannot be instantiated twice. There we go. And then we're going to need, of course, a logging method, right? So let's call it log event, which is gonna receive a message of type string. And to make our logger easy, we're gonna just print in the console our message. So now we're gonna build our class that is gonna use our logger. Let's say we want to implement a log when the view of a view controller loads. So let's say we have our view controller class, which has some viewDidLoad method. Here we would typically do a call to our static accessor, shared instance, and we would log something like view loaded, right? So what we have here is a singleton. So we invoke our shared instance directly from within our view controller or our class that we want to log. The first reason why it's not a good idea to log events like this is because we are hiding dependencies in our classes. So for instance, in our view controller, the logger becomes an implicit dependency because we're accessing it directly by our static accessor, the shared instance. Now this might be okay if you only have, let's say, one dependency, but if you abuse of this anti-pattern, the singleton anti-pattern, you will start to have many implicit dependencies in your classes, and very easily and very quickly your classes will become coupled with all their implicit dependencies and the code will not be maintainable anymore. This is an example of a real code base I worked on in the past. We have this view controller called new home view controller. Bad naming, by the way. Everything in this view controller is accessed with a static accessor. You have this logger in this case, it's called CIB logger. And the problem with this is that now my view controller is coupled to a lot of dependencies which are being accessed directly. And if one of these dependencies would change, it would affect the way my view controller behaves. Not only that, if some other class would change our static accessor, we have temporal coupling. And in this temporal coupling, it's undefined the behavior I might have in my view controller if some other class changes my shared instance before I use it. So the second reason why it's not a great idea to log events this way is module coupling. To visualize the relationships we have in our components, let's go into this little diagram I have created. So we have our view controller that, as we saw in the example, it depends on the logger. And let's say this view controller belongs to some module that we have in our application. So feature A, which has the view controller and logs events with this logger. Now imagine we have a second view controller that also wants to log events. So it will also depend on our logger. And they both belong to this feature A module. But imagine that this second view controller actually belongs to another feature, feature B. Now, if we wanted to move our second view controller to this feature B, we have this issue. Either make module with feature B depend on module with feature A, because the second view controller depends on our logger, or we could duplicate our logger, and now our second view controller doesn't depend on feature A anymore. But now we have code duplication. We have two loggers which are exactly the same, living in two different modules, which is not ideal. If tomorrow we want to change the way we log, we would have to change the loggers in each of the modules because we have code duplication. So this is the problem with logging events this way. We either have a duplication of the logger, or our feature B would depend on feature A. Now there's another thing we can do here. We can create a third module. Let's call it logger module. And then we can drag our logger implementation to this logger module. Now we can make both our features, feature A and B, depend on in this logger module. And now we got rid of the code duplication for the logger. But the downside here is that both our features are depending on a concrete implementation of the logger. The arrows coming out show that our features directly depend on the logger framework or module. This is violating the dependency inversion principle of the solid principles. Our features should not depend on concrete implementations. This is how our three-module architecture would look like. We have the logger module. We need to make the accessor public and also the logging event. And then we have to import the logger module to feature A and also to feature B. So as you can see, we fixed the logger duplication in each of the features, but as we have module coupling, now depend on the logger's concrete implementation, violating the dependency inversion principle. Now let's jump into the third reason why we shouldn't log events this way, and that's harder unit testing. So here I have created a unit test file, singleton logger tests, and what I want to do is I want to implement a new feature applying TDD, test driven development. So let's say I want to implement some behavior when my view controller loads. For TDD, we're going to follow the given, when, then structure. And in the given section, we're going to instantiate our view controller, which is our system under test. So we're going to call it SUT. And let's say we want to inject some behavior in our view controller when the view loads. So our view controller might have some kind of closure that we're going to inject through property injection. So we can name our property onViewDidLoad, and it's going to be a closure. Now let's go implement the closure. And this closure has to be optional. Now we want to test that our closure is invoked. So we invoke the viewDidLoad method of our view controller. And we want to assert. And for this we can have some kind of boolean. So in the assertion, we assert that our boolean was set to true when the view loads. So let's run the tests. And of course it fails because we are not doing anything yet. So now, following TDD, we're gonna invoke our onViewDidLoad closure, run tests again, and it passes. So far so good, but what's the problem here? As you can see, we printed view loaded. In this case, we're doing two things, logging and doing our custom behavior. What if we just wanted to isolate our viewDidLoad behavior and avoid logging events? The logger, it will always be invoked when we call the viewDidLoad method from our view controller. There's no harm in this case because our logger just prints to the console. But imagine if our logger implemented, let's say, Firebase, and Firebase in their logging event would make a request to their backend, that would really give an overhead in time to our test. As you can see, our test only lasted 1 millisecond. But if we had a login event to Firebase, our request, it would take 50 milliseconds. The other problem is that we would be logging events every time we run our tests, which is not what we want. There are things we can do to avoid logging real events, like for example, creating a Boolean variable called login enabled. We can set it to true by default. And then we can do something like login enabled, then we print, and then in our test we can set our login enabled to false, run the tests, and now the test passed and there is no view loaded printed in the console. But look at this, I had to change my logger implementation, my production code, just to satisfy my test. Also, I made my code more complicated. Now I have a conditional. This brings to confusion. Let's say I forgot to set the login enabled variable to true, and now suddenly I may see that I stopped logging events. So as you can see, this can bring me to unexpected bugs. Also, my test became more complicated. Now I will be setting to false the logger's login enabled variable in every test that tests a class that logs events this way. And the fourth reason why you shouldn't be logging events this way is logging spam in your code. Let's go back to our legacy code base, and I have searched CIB logger, which is the singleton they use in this project. As you can see, we have calls to the CIB logger shared instance to log pretty much everywhere in our methods. This makes our code a lot harder to read. We have another log right here, log, 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 log. In this case, we are violating the first principle of the solid principles, the single responsibility principle. This class, as you can see, it's doing a lot of things. One of them is also logging events. And that contributes to making our code harder and more unmaintainable. And that's all for this video. I hope that you find it useful and that you were able to identify the issues of logging events this way. Stay tuned, because in the next one I'm going to show you a clean, maintainable and scalable way of logging events that is going to improve the quality of your code, respecting the solid principles and avoiding all the inconveniences and problems that using singletons this way can bring us. So give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and see you in the next one.